This is episode 491 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined by Glen Lyons. Glen has extensive experience with ERCOT in Texas and with ExxonMobil, a small oil and gas enterprise. And he is also someone who attempted or was a candidate for New Mexico's Public Regulation Commission. And we're going to talk about that as well as some ideas that Glen has for New Mexico's economy. So welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Glen.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I know I gave you the quick, or gave folks the quick background on yourself and some of your professional roles, but why don't you fill in a few of the gaps and ultimately tell us why you wanted to be a PRC commissioner in the state of New Mexico?
Okay. All right. You may have to give me a cue every so often if you want to cut me off, because once I get going, I can go. So I'm just giving you that fair warning up front.
I will do that.
All right. Very good. So I retired from ExxonMobil back in June of last year after more than 36 years working for the company. Had a common kind of career path in that it included a wide variety of assignments working in different parts of the company. The last 8 years of it, I'm not an engineer, I'm a commercial person by training and experience, but the last 8 years of it, I was the company's lead on electricity policy and regulation for the US. Now, let me explain what that means. Basically, I had to figure out what issues does the company need to engage in? What are our positions on those issues? What's the best way for us to engage? And then are we actually engaging effectively as we would wish? Those kinds of issues range from relatively, I'm going to use the word simple, but they're far from simple. Things like utility tariffs, because ExxonMobil is a large consumer of electricity. And so we're paying a lot of money every year to utilities. So tariff impacts are important. Access to the grid for new operations. We're doing a lot of drilling in New Mexico, make sure that we've got good access to the grid. If there are reliability concerns, addressing those concerns. And then it also ended up migrating into bigger threats to an oil and gas company like greenhouse gas emissions. The power sector is the first place everybody goes to try to decarbonize an economy. And then as well, because at the end of the day, ExxonMobil is not an electricity consumer, we're an oil and gas company. And so worrying about subsidies for renewables. In former President Trump's first year in office, he was trying to get subsidies for coal generation. So things like that as well were part of the deal. In that time, I had experience working at the federal level, as well as 7 different states, including New Mexico, basically the states wherever ExxonMobil has a large operational footprint. And that's basically how I became very attuned to what's going on in New Mexico. I was aware of the changeover in the commission. I knew I was nearing retirement. I also knew that, quite frankly, for that kind of job, the caliber of person you're typically looking for, it paid very poorly. And I figured, okay.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I'm going to
take no, please. I told you would have to.
So, yeah, they were paying $90,000 for the PRC, correct? Right. Is that about right? What they were? Okay. So you were at ERCOT. Now, ERCOT is it some ways similar to New Mexico's PRC. Were you there when things went haywire a few years back with the electricity situation in Texas, and or kind of, what lessons, based on, I'm sure, your following of that situation, what kind of lessons would you have taken to New Mexico's PRC? Because just to be clear, you did not make the cut, and I do want to talk about that. You were not, you're not ultimately on our PRC at this point, but
Right.
What did you see go wrong at ERCOT, either front row or maybe middle row, if you were not involved, and kind of what lessons did you would you take from that?
Well, first, let me just clarify what ERCOT is. ERCOT is not like the PRC. In Texas, we have the Public Utility Commission. That's like the PRC.
Okay.
ERCOT is, without getting too electricity wonkish on you, I don't know if Public Service of New Mexico, no, I'm sorry, not PNM, SPS, Southwestern Public Service Company, also known as Excel, down in the southeastern portion of the state. They are part of a larger grid that is called SPP, Southwest Power Pool. And ERCOT is like this Southwest Power Pool. If you don't know what that means, that's fine. I'll explain anyway. ERCOT basically managed the flow of electricity in most of the state of Texas. They're not a utility. They're kind of a pseudo utility sitting over and above utilities. They tell generators when to turn on, when to turn off. If there's an event and there's not enough electricity on the grid, which was part of what happened during Winter Storm Uri, they'll tell utilities, okay, you need to cut off a certain amount of load or demand because we don't have enough electricity to go around. They also run the wholesale market for electricity. It's pretty substantial as well. But ERCOT doesn't actually own or operate any of these things. They just sort of sit there and oversee it and give out instructions. Somebody once compared it to like airport flight control, telling the planes take off, land, that runway, but they don't actually own or operate the planes themselves. So that's kind of the ERCOT, what ERCOT does. Now, my role was I was a member of the board of directors on ERCOT for several years, including during Winter Storm Uri. And Winter Storm Uri was a very unfortunate situation for so many reasons. It brought record cold. It brought record cold for a record period of time. It brought record cold for a record period of time over a record portion of the state. Typically, when we have periods of extreme cold in Texas, it doesn't cover the entire state. This covered the entire state, and then it just sat there for several days. That's very rare. And then we also had some freezing precipitation, which made everything worse as well. So any one of these things would have been a problem. Throw them all together, and it was weather conditions that nobody was prepared for, nobody anticipated. So you want me to go to what's wrong or what went wrong, or do you want to maybe me take a break and let you jump in with a question?
Well, if you can do it, expeditiously, we do have a lot to talk about. So, obviously this was a unique event in Texas weather history, but Texas has also done a lot of renewables, despite its being a red state. It's not always along partisan lines. So was that the issue? Was it something else from your perspective? So yeah, kind of walk us through where, 50,000 feet, where you think things went wrong at ERCOT during that cold snap.
So with most major disasters anywhere in the world, whatever it is, electricity or anything, typically people will find when they study it, oh my gosh, there were several things that went wrong. It wasn't one thing. So there are people out there who want to blame renewables. It wasn't renewables. There are people out there who want to blame fossil fuels. It wasn't fossil fuels. It was everything went wrong. Lots of generation failed for a variety of reasons, and generation of all types and all flavors. Natural gas supply had challenges. Part of that is just historical. When it gets really cold, natural gas production has problems, and people know about that. but the electricity sector is not so tuned into that. I think they finally are now. You had electricity being cut off to natural gas production. So imagine I'm producing natural gas, I'm supplying your power plant, and then somebody cuts off my power. Now you got no gas going to your power plant. That was a coordination problem. You had to keep natural gas production going, you need people to run trucks out to the wells on a regular basis to unload produced water to take it to where it can be treated. Roads were impassable because the state of Texas wasn't prepared to keep roads clean and ice free, and we were not about to send guys down dangerous roads. And then on top of all that, and I'm probably skipping a few other big ones, but one of the other big ones was you have backups of backups of backups. So all different ways you can get yourself in the electricity world through a bad situation. One of the last backups is you have rotating outages. So what that means is we don't have enough generation on the grid. We need utilities to start cutting off load, or that's basically consumers. So what a utility typically would do is they may have 4 neighborhoods. They're gonna cut this neighborhood for 4 hours. Then they'll turn their power back on, cut this neighborhood for 4 hours, rotate to the next neighborhood, and then to the 4th neighborhood, and then run it through all over again. The idea being that nobody's without power for that long a period of time. But it turned out that a lot of utilities simply were unable to rotate because they'd start with this neighborhood and go, oh, wait a minute, there's a fire station there. We can't cut off power to a fire station. So we won't cut their power. We'll cut this neighborhood's power. Oh, wait, there's a hospital there. We can't cut off to a hospital. And they quickly found themselves limited on how many neighborhoods, if you will, they could rotate through. And so that's not supposed to happen. The way the thing should work is, again, it should be rotated. Some people were without electricity for a day, several days. Bitter cold weather, no power, no heat. That's a very dangerous situation.
All right. Well, we'll move on now to New Mexico, and you explained some of the personal reasons that led you to put your hat in the ring for that. I think the most interesting thing for our listeners is the process. How do you feel about the process that was used? And of course, this is a process that was put in place because of a constitutional amendment that was approved by the voters, I think in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And it shifted to an appointed PRC, 3 members though, only instead of 5. Did you feel like your application was fairly considered? And what kinds of issues were you asked about during that process?
I actually felt very good about the process. I watched every meeting. I had met a few of the participants beforehand. I mean, not because I knew they were going to be part of this committee or that I was applying for the job. It was just part of my ExxonMobil work. I really was impressed by their thoughtfulness, the fact that they really wanted to cast a wide net, or that's what their thinking was, cast a wide net, let's get the best candidates rather than worrying about the political wins. And so I was very encouraged by it. I think there were something like 65 or 70 applicants. They interviewed 15. I was one of those 15. So I think I feel like they recognized that this guy looks like a pretty good candidate. So I felt good about that. I would say the most challenging questions I got during the interview, which I'm sure were unique to me, were about ERCOT and trying to understand what happened and why I am not partially to blame, probably. I mean, that wasn't asked specifically, but I think that's sort of what was suggested, or probably behind the question was, if we're going to put this guy's name forward as a PRC commissioner, how's it going to look if he is somehow to blame for the Winter Storm Uri impact on ERCOT?
Yeah, I think that would be a question they would ask, because not only is electricity reliability critical in general, but PNM, the state's largest utility, is concerned and has expressed publicly concern about keeping the lights on as soon as this summer due to the closure of the San Juan generating coal-fired power plant. Was that issue, the Energy Transition Act, was that discussed in detail in your interview process?
Actually, no, it was not. I would say most of the interview questions, quite frankly, were, I wouldn't call them standard interview questions, but it was more about trying to get to know me, try to understand what might I bring to the party.
Okay. And that's fair, I guess. It seems like that would be an important issue that they would want to discuss and address, because it has been in the past something that was very important to the PRC, and they've played a central role in not in the legislative side of things, but in the implementation side of the Energy Transition Act. Another issue.
And let me just
go ahead.
say, if you don't mind, just interjecting
Yeah.
really quickly. I mean, so the PRC, they're handed. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but they basically were handed the Energy Transition Act, and regardless of what they've done with it thus far, I mean, it's not like they have options. Their job is to figure out, how do you implement, right?
Yeah, it's not that simple, but it is somewhat. There was an issue or a concern about that PNM had wished to build out some natural gas peaking plans as a component of the transition, and that was denied by the PRC, and they basically decided to move forward with the complete transition to renewables, no natural gas kind of being brought online, or limited natural gas being brought online to facilitate that transition. So yeah, the PRC definitely had a role, and there was some rulemaking and discussion of how that transition is supposed to happen. But when push comes to shove, the legislature's the one making the policies. It's really their baby, so to speak, that and the governor. Another issue, and I'm just trying to get a feeling for what kinds of questions were being asked in that whole process. Something that's been very critical recently is the merger of PNM with Iberdrola, Avangrid, Spanish-controlled utility. Was that brought up in the process at all?
It's interesting that you ask me that, because I heard from two people independently after my interview that I somehow gave an impression that I was anti the merger, when the truth is I know very little about the merger. And so I didn't have an opinion, and so I'm not even sure what I said during the interview that caused some people to walk away with that sort of impression. I think I may have said some anti-utility things during my interview, which are pretty true and genuine opinions, but yeah, I don't have a view on the merger.
Okay, well, I'm intrigued by the discussion around the merger, because to give you the quick history of the way that all happened is I firmly believe that the Energy Transition Act was passed as an adjunct to the merger, that the idea of moving towards so-called green energy was hand in glove with the idea that PNM wasn't necessarily going to have to shepherd that transition through its conclusion, that it would be part of an effort with another utility that was much more focused on kind of green energy. And certainly that's Avangrid's bailiwick. That's their main thing. And then the shift from, this, of course, being originally considered by a 5-person elected PRC. The hearing commissioner recommended against the merger. The PRC agreed with her unanimously. And then we had this shift in the PRC itself. And the assumption kind of was always that this new PRC was going to be much more friendly to the idea of the merger than the elected PRC, and that once they were seated, they would approve the merger. And this is kind of where things stand right now, is that the PRC, clearly as it is constituted right now, is much friendlier towards the merger than the past PRC, and the expectation is that they will move forward with the merger, rightly or wrongly. That's what's going to happen. My organization, we haven't taken a formal position on the merger in and of itself, but we've opposed the Energy Transition Act, of course, that the legislature passed and seems to have caused this implementation. So anyway, I know that's a very complicated and long explanation, but I was trying to just get at the idea of whether that was a litmus test for PRC commissioners. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but it was certainly, yeah. You think it was?
No, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, the fact that, again, I don't even remember a question on it. I certainly don't remember saying anything about it. And then somehow 2 people walked away with that impression. So perhaps reading between the lines of things I said, that also perhaps recognizing that that was that critical of an issue. But again, I don't have a view on it. And I didn't realize at the time that that was a kind of a hot button issue.
Yeah. And, there's any number of reasons why you may not have made the final cut with the PRC. And again, these are people that the governor selected for that office. So, there was clearly a expectation that the PRC, as reconstituted by her, would be much more favorable to the merger. So it's, you may not have been on the list anyway, but that conversation, the fact that it did come up, highlights, I think, the importance that they viewed that issue with. So anyway,
I do have, I just want to,
ahead.
again, my experience with this committee was really pretty solid.
That's good. That's good.
And 2 of the committee members, who I won't name, but one appointed by a Republican, one appointed by a Democrat, reached out to me after the fact. So after we knew that I wasn't on the short list, and encouraged me to keep looking at opportunities in New Mexico. So I felt like there were, there were people who recognized what I could bring to the party and appreciated it. And maybe it just wasn't this particular job. In fact, I will also share, this is my interpretation, my version of what I was told when I asked for feedback and why I didn't get picked. And I was told, well, first of all, you're oil and gas. Secondly, you're ExxonMobil. That's worse than being oil and gas. Third, you're not from New Mexico. Fourth, you're from Texas. That's worse than not being from New Mexico. And fifth,
those are all accurate statements.
You were associated with ERCOT. And while I honestly, truly believe I would have been the best candidate, or that I was the best candidate, if I was in their shoes, I probably would have used very similar logic.
That's totally fair. Those are all legitimate. And I'm not implying that you or your position on the merger was the defining issue of all of this. I would say that it may have been a factor, a significant factor perhaps. But anyway, we'll leave that conversation there. And now we're going to kind of get to part two of our conversation, because do you have a background in economics, or can you describe maybe a little bit about your educational background and your views on economics? Because that's obviously somewhat different from regulatory policy.
So I would describe myself as an armchair free market economist. I came to it, probably 20 years ago or so, just sort of happenstance. I would, fortunately, the internet became a thing. I mean, it's something I never heard anything about in college. I was trained on Keynesian economics, and I went to business school. And in business school, there wasn't a whole lot as far as free market focus goes. So I came to it late in life. Thank God that the internet took off, because otherwise I don't know how, other than having somebody introduce you to these things, I don't know how I would have ever found this stuff. But actually, I employed a lot of that thinking in my job. I mean, it's people knew me as like, oh, okay, if it's a markets question, we need to get Glen's opinion on it, because Glen's really the markets guy, because he thinks about markets all the time, and not markets like electricity markets, which are frankly pseudo-regulatory artificial constructs. They're not markets at all. But at least I could always bring sort of the logic, and let's think about issues from the perspective of the economics and the marketplace. So it's essentially self-taught, but I've had a lot of friends and colleagues who've been very helpful in sort of helping me think about things.
And that's totally fair. And that's not to denigrate at all the well thought out idea that you put forth in a piece that, I don't know, we'll see if Rio Grande Foundation can do something with this or publish it in some way, shape, or form. But you write about New Mexico economically and the oil and gas industry and the resource curse as you see it, and some solutions for that. So why don't you briefly summarize the resource curse and the article that you wrote, because you'll do a better job than I will.
Okay, I will, but I will also go on, so you'll need to cut me off at some point, Paul. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
There's a joke I tell, which is I can't say hello in under 30 seconds. So the resource curse is a phrase commonly employed to low-income countries that suddenly find themselves awash in oil money, oil being the resource. And the curse is, you would think that being awash in oil and the wealth that it should bring should increase the country's economy as well. And often what happens is you don't see that. You either see very little impact, or in some cases, you'll actually see negative impact as a result. And how can that be? Well, basically, the problem is that the government squanders the wealth. A good example of a country that's done that is kind of Venezuela. Venezuela is poster child for the resource curse. Venezuela has the most oil resource in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia. And Venezuela is just a desperately poor country with lots of challenges. So, the question is then, so how does that happen? Well, there's multiple ways that governments can squander the resource. One is corruption. That's the first one everybody thinks of. The more money there is floating around, the more temptation there is for corruption. But if we leave corruption to the side, because that's kind of an ugly topic, any government with lots of money flowing in is going to want to do what we just saw in New Mexico, which is they're going to want to spend it. How do we spend all this money? And the more money they've got to spend, the quicker they try to spend it, they're just going to do a less thoughtful job with each new program. And so you're going to have some leakage of value through that. Every new program they try to create ultimately is not an economically efficient program. It's going to be a political bargain, because that's the way bills move forward. is I want to spend money here, you want to get something over there, we need to put them together in a bill. I know this is not necessarily the best example to pick, and my wife, who is very much a progressive liberal, tried to discourage me from focusing on this example, but I think it makes the case well. So free lunches for school children. Who would oppose, anything that's going to help alleviate childhood hunger? Not me. I think that's a great idea. However, do we need a program to universally pay for lunch for all kids? Not everybody needs it. Do we need to include in that program that all, you would think if it was a business doing it, you'd look for who's the best supplier, most reliable, lowest cost. But in the bill, as I understand it, we incorporate things like, well, it's got to be locally sourced. So that's part of the political bargain. That's part of how you see leakage through that as well. And then the last thing is, and this might be the worst of all, is the more programs being developed, the more money being spent, the less focused the government can be on those important things that we all want government to do a really good job of. Crime is one of those things that comes to mind. I know I saw the governor speak out about, I'm going to try again on crime next time, because that's a critical function for government. And so that's how you get into this sort of resource curse. Now,
let me jump in right there real quick, because I don't know if you know this or not, but I believe it was yesterday the governor signed the free lunch, universal school lunch program into law. And obviously we have a massive surplus in New Mexico. So your example is very apt, whether your wife likes it or not. So you can tell her I said you're right and she's wrong. But anyway,
that's not going to help my marriage.
So and there's additional issues. First and foremost, you mentioned the lack of need, and that obviously a lot of people don't need the free lunch. Then there's the exact nature of what is being fed to the kids. Just the way it works, you're going to wind up with basically a one size fits all, more or less lunch program. I have a daughter who's a vegetarian. She's still a conservative, which is great, but she is a vegetarian, and she's probably not going to want to eat the food that is given out. There are other issues with individual dietary requirements, taste buds, just kids whose parents might take the initiative and feed their own kids rather than relying on the state to do it. So you're going to have not just wasted food, but wasted resources there inherent in the program. So I think that is one of many, many problems with this, let alone the cost. I believe it's $30 million a year, and it'll probably go up, and then there'll be politicization down the road of exactly what is fed to the kids, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope I've covered that angle. Maybe you have other critiques of that, but I wanted to elaborate a little bit because it's so pertinent here in New Mexico.
Yeah, no, that was good. So you want me to go into now? So what?
Yeah, what do you want to do? What is the Glen Lyons solution to the resource curse in New Mexico?
So the simple version of it is just take all that oil and gas money and give it to the citizens of New Mexico. That eliminates the whole problem right there. I read somewhere last year, and I don't recall who it was who said it, that they're looking at, the state is looking at maybe $5 billion coming in from oil and gas money in the next year. And if I did my math right, that's roughly $2,500 per person. And I would argue, take that $2,500 and cut a check to every citizen in the state. So $2,500 per person. That might not, be, something that would be life-changing for you or me. But if you're a low-income family of four, so that's 2,500 times 4, that's $10,000. That's now life-changing. So not only is that a way of avoiding the resource curse. It's a way of putting money into the hands of the people who need it. They will make the decisions that are best for their family as to how do we spend this money. Rather than, maybe they don't want a free lunch program. Maybe they don't want, I don't know what other sort of programs that the government's got in mind. But then, and there is precedent for it. Alaska has kind of a program like that. They call it their permanent fund dividend. It's extremely politically popular, by the way. One shouldn't be surprised to find out that if the state is cutting checks to people for $5,000, $10,000, that's going to be hugely popular. But just throw a data point on it. Several years ago, oil prices were very low in the $10 range. The state was hurting because it's counting on getting all this oil money to fund its activities. So it had to put to the citizens a vote saying, hey, allow us to take some of your dividend money and use it for the state government, and all the powers that be that were very supportive of that vote, voting in favor of that. And it lost by like 84%. I mean, there are not a lot of things that lose votes by 84%. So I see this as, you put the money in the hands of the people who need it, into the hands of people who are going to make the best decisions as to how to spend it. That's the best thing for long-term economic growth. It will be very politically popular, not surprising. But then I would take it one step further as well. I think that there are some people who would see that, as like a great long-term opportunity. Oh, I'm going to get money just rolling in from the state from this oil and gas revenue for many years, and that's just a great thing. Other people may look at it and say, well, I need money today. So if you could basically take all these revenues and put it into some sort of corporate-like structure, and instead of just giving people a check, you actually give them literally a share that they can then sell their share if they want to trade it for cash today, or for those who see the long-term growth as being terrific, they can buy shares. It creates an open market for these things. So those who maybe want to effectively do that same concept, but there's no structure for it, may get taken advantage of otherwise. And then the other benefit of this is citizens become very interested in how the state is managing and stewarding and regulating the oil and gas industry. And they may take that in a way that says, we don't care about their money and we want even less of this oil and gas industry, or they go the other way with it. I don't know which way they go, but having voter engagement seems like a very healthy thing for a democracy.
All right. So we don't have much time left, but I will, my reaction to your piece was, I agree with you. What you say, if implemented, would be very superior, very much superior to what has happened during the recent years in New Mexico that we've experienced this oil boom. This year, 14% spending increase. Previous years also double digits, and that's on top of an already incredibly bloated governments at the state level and local level here in New Mexico. Then you've got programs like film subsidies and other boondoggles like our spaceports and the rail runner. I could go on and on and on and on, and have done on this show. But Alaska, the state most analogous to New Mexico in this regard, although not the oil producer it once was, lacked a personal income tax and a sales tax, and was doing what you say with regard to some level of individual stake, and details may vary, but Alaska is what you cite as a U.S. state that has done this most closely. Wouldn't you want to do more to make New Mexico a business-friendly state first before you set up some of these kinds of programs where you return the money to the individual New Mexicans?
Well, I would argue, so I mean, I think your concept is to reduce business taxes as a way to make it less burdensome to operate as business in New Mexico, right?
Business and individual, yes.
Yeah. And I have take no exception to that whatsoever. I mean, I'm 100% aligned with you. I think that's a great idea. I think that's an important thing. I guess where I was coming from it was it's a tough political sell.
That's fair. Yeah.
Telling people I'm going to cut you a check for your family, $10,000 this year. That's a political winner. I would even think, if I was listening to this and I was a politically ambitious individual in New Mexico, if I didn't have a better idea to latch onto, this certainly seems like a great one. I could see, while I'm always, like my libertarian and friends and would love to see them succeed. I think, if they wanted to take ownership of an issue like this, I mean, that could really help put the Libertarian Party on the map in a significant way in New Mexico. Yeah, I think that's part of the attractiveness of it. I will also say that at the end of the day, I believe, real economic growth comes from at the low level. I mean, people just spending money, going about their business, doing their thing. And if there's all this money sitting there in the state, we need to get it redeployed as efficiently as possible. Cutting taxes is probably a better first step. But again, I just think in terms of like political attractiveness, it's probably a tougher sell.
Yeah, well, politics is always a stumbling block, and we could go chapter and verse about all of the challenges that any sanity regarding economic policy in New Mexico faces. We have this gross receipts tax that we have been fighting against for years, pyramiding just one aspect of the gross receipts tax, and yet the legislature with the $3.6 billion budget surplus failed to act on that. And Mark Ronchetti, the Republican gubernatorial candidate in the last election, proposed a rebate program. And I hate to say it, but I think the Democrats and the left were able to turn that into an issue that caused problems for Ronchetti. Now, we could talk about candidates and their approaches and their campaigns, et cetera, but she was pretty adept in pushing back against that. But, I never underestimate the GOP in snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory. And I'm not saying it's easy. This is not an easy state. There's no question, because too many of our people don't pay taxes, and too many people in New Mexico are on government programs. So it's a very difficult proposition. But I think what we'll do, and we'll talk about this off the air real quick, but I would like to publish this as a guest post on Errors of Enchantment, our regular blog in its entirety, and just kind of send it around and see what people think about it, and share a little bit about who you are and just your interest in New Mexico. So we'll talk about that, but we got to move to the conclusion phase here. So any final thoughts on kind of either of the subjects we've discussed, or kind of where you see the PRC and some of the issues that you could have been dealing with that organization, and you think they're in good hands?
I think they're in pretty good hands. I don't think to not sound like I'm full of myself, but I really think what they are lacking, and that almost all commissions are lacking throughout the country, is a real consumer focus. It's just not there. And the regulation tends to favor the regulated utility. Regulation is complicated. The utilities play the game better than anybody, and the commissioners tend not to be very good at pushing back. Not saying that they don't want to, but it takes you years of sort of learning before you get good at that. I think the commission's in pretty good shape. I do think they need to have a stronger consumer focus.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for your time, Glenn. Is there any way that you would want people to be able to contact you, or do you have social media for people to follow you? Any of that?
I would say probably the easiest thing is to find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I have used LinkedIn as a way to form a network, less about business, more about free market and libertarian sort of thinking. And if people connect to me on LinkedIn too, you'll see what I'm reading and what I think is interesting. And hopefully a lot of your listeners or viewers will find that useful.
All right. Well, I'm not super active on LinkedIn, but I'll do it just for you. So,
all right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate all your time and information. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.